Okay, so just so the audience understands, if you went on missions to assassinate someone, they would change your age, give you special training, etc., to be able to take on adult tasks, right?
Yes, that is what we did, or what they did to us, always.
Okay, can you talk about some of your life missions in space, both in the future and the past?
Okay, so the Avalon mission is an interesting one. It was on a planet called Avalon. I don't know what star system that's in, but it was one of the few that I can remember that was messing with the future, and probably the only one actually in Alex's life that was messing with the future.
It was in, I think, the 28th century, something like, no, 29th century. He was dealing with a real estate development family by the name of Tanaka.
Again, getting technologies and also ensuring that the power structure that was being built up by Project Phoenix or Montauk would stay in place that far into the future. So what he was doing there was what amounted to pretty much corporate espionage. And what he was to do was to go there and ingratiate himself with the family. And the way he went about that was by forming a relationship with the daughter of this gentleman. And they were successful. I don't know if, I think he did pretty much fall in love, but of course he had to leave at the end of it all. And he was working alongside a hacker. I will not name this hacker. I'll use the pseudonym that I'm using for him in the book because he is also part of Kyle's life. He was at Camp Hero for many years. Ivan Roth. Roth was a hacker, an extremely accomplished one from the breakaway, and Roth would hack into the Tanaka real estate company's database and gather intel. Again, like I said, corporate espionage. And by the end of it, I would say they were there a good 30 years. Tanaka Real Estate was no more, and another competing company, the details of which I cannot recall, were in power, and they were aligned with the goals of Project Phoenix. So yeah, that's how that went. I can recall it was a very futuristic city, of course, cyberpunk, but not like dystopian cyberpunk. It was like utopian cyberpunk. It was incredible on this planet. Alex and this woman, her name was Emiko Tanaka, lived in a massive penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The one alien thing I can remember from that planet is there were blue tigers. They looked just like ours, but they were blue. Like royal blue, almost. Very deep blue. Whether they were an alien animal entirely, or whether they were based on ours that they had been genetically modified, I mean, who knows, really. But that's the one really alien thing I can remember from there.
Another one was one during the Orion Wars, which was off-planet in the Bellatrix system, Bellatrix Secunda, not Bellatrix Prime. We were there protecting someone. At that time she was a child, but she would eventually become a military leader within the Orion War, which had already started long before she was born, but yeah, she eventually became quite important, and we were protecting her from murder attempts and so on. Kind of, I guess you could compare it kind of to the Terminator movies. And to do that, we had to live on this planet in this village kind of out of the way. These people were very psychic. They could have seen right through any cover story that we had, so we didn't even bother trying to hide. That was kind of interesting because we were forced to adapt to live with these people. Air was breathable and everything, but their lifestyle was different. They're hard to describe. Their skin was a very dark olive green color. They were around 9 feet tall, and they had almost like rabbit ears. Otherwise, their body shape was the same as ours, and gray hair for the most part. Some of them had red hair, some of them had black hair. Those are Bellatrixes. That's the correct diminutive term, and they have the most remarkable musical talents. They sing opera, but it's at a frequency level that listening to it, it's almost hypnotic. You feel like you're floating when you're listening to one of them sing. It's incredible. And there was where I wrote one of the songs that we'll get to in the music episode. But Anyway, there were three of us, me and two other people. We were age advanced to be adult men for this mission.
And what about that mission to the Renaissance times on Earth?
Mission to Italy, right. This was to the 1400s, I believe, based on the clothes that people were wearing, to the city of Siena in Italy. Alex had to become best friends with, and sabotage the work of an inventor who would have invented certain things too early for Project Phoenix's goals to be carried out. I cannot remember his name, and he has been completely lost to history. Alex was successful. This man was inventing certain devices. I can recall he invented something like a rudimentary airship. He invented some sort of a device with gears in it. I don't remember the nature of it exactly. And he invented several other things. He was several centuries ahead of his time. And Alex moved there when this man was a teenager. Alex's handler also was there. And eventually Alex and his handler were quote-unquote married, and that was the cover story for her always being around him, was that she was his wife. And he did make himself this man's best friend. He would sabotage this man's work or just steal it and take it to a dead drop. But most of the time he would sabotage it. He would accidentally, quote-unquote, knock things off the shelves. He would covertly arrange burglaries so that this man's papers and or things he had built would be stolen. He made it all seem like this man had the worst luck in the universe, and he died when he was about 45, which I guess, that was a fairly normal age to die back then. But yeah, he did that, and he died in complete obscurity, no different than anyone else around him, which is quite sad. So that's the mission to Italy, summarized. I remember he felt very guilty and that it was a very unpleasant task for him, I think for obvious reasons, but if he had tried to not, then he would have been violently punished and they would have sent someone else who could. There was no getting out of things being done. Things never went undone in Project Phoenix. It was always either the person who was assigned to it did it or they found someone else who would. So it's not a great system to be out there.
And what about the missions to China and Asia?
There's tons we could say about Chinese missions. Most of them are from the Kyle period, which I guess, again, sounding like a broken record, someday maybe we'll get to. In Alex's period, there were ones there just, again, observing things. The Chinese had airships early on, I think in around probably the late Ming period, so late 1500s, I guess, something like that. But a lot of it was also archaeological stuff, very similar to the Egyptian stuff, and again, they never told you what the actual stuff you were finding was. You just found it, and then you never heard or saw it again.
I don't have a whole lot of detail on the Chinese missions. Those memories are still fairly faint. I just remember being in airships there in 1600s, so in the late Ming or early Qing dynasty period. In fact, I think it was the early Qing dynasty, because I do remember seeing signs out in public in Manchu, so yeah, that would have been the Qing dynasty period. My other memories of Chinese missions from Alex that are more detailed are from actually later on when he was in Looking Glass. So we'll get to the Looking Glass stuff eventually. I'm sure we can go there, but on the Montauk subject, not a whole lot. Other missions to Asia. Again, not that I can specifically recall, there were some that were very quick that may have been in Asia, just purely based on topography, because there were some that were out in the middle of nowhere in camps, or on archaeological digs out in the middle of nowhere. It was set amongst karst scenery and jungles. So yeah, I guess that probably would have had to have been somewhere in Asia, probably China or northern Vietnam, or in some of the non-jungle area where it was still karst scenery. I guess that could have also been in Siberia. They didn't always tell you where you were going, and when you got there, people didn't always either tell you or they didn't always know themselves. So sometimes there was this ambiguity, which they kept it that way, so that you would just be doing your job. You wouldn't actually know what was going on.
And what kind of airships were these in China?
Like a Zeppelin or a dirigible, like the, the Hindenburg, that kind of thing. Yeah, they had those in China in the 1600s, at least the very wealthy did.
And you think they were anti-grav?
Anti-grav, I believe so, yes. Yeah, because I remember seeing the engine of one once, and it was like spinning, like similar to a Hanabu engine. So yeah, it was anti-grav.
Okay, now let's go to the Atlantis missions.
To begin with, there we actually just went in to live lives there and get as much information on the technologies as we could. And we were expected to find life paths there that would allow us to do that, but we weren't given that much instruction. What I wound up doing was becoming the curator of a museum. Yes, they had museums in Atlantis, which was, it was kind of like a science museum, although of course it was at a level so far above the science museums that we're familiar with that it would probably be insulting to call it that. But that's the closest I can think of, where it would showcase, they showcased technological advancements from all over the galaxy. And I became the curator there. Sometimes I would manage to grab an actual thing to smuggle out back to Montauk, because they had I should mention, they had a portal set up, hidden somewhere. I think it might, again, have been in an alleyway type of thing, where no one ever went, and where you couldn't see anything there unless you were standing in it. But usually what I would do is just take copious photographs using a small little spy camera and send them back, or put them in a dead drop for someone else to take back.
Did you have to guys being, modified for the mission physically, genetically? Because it was obviously not the same anthropotype, I guess. At that time, there had to be some kind of disguise, right, made.
I believe there were DNA modifications to live in Atlantis. I couldn't tell you what exactly they were. Again, I have to keep repeating this, but they didn't tell you much. They just did things and gave you an idea of what you were supposed to do.
What do you remember? Because you said you stayed there for quite a number of years. What do you remember, like where it was? I guess it was on the main island that sank. Where it was, what did the city look like? What did the people look like? Any interesting structures, anything that you can think about. And the environment, like the nature, what was it like? Maybe the animals, like anything you can remember, it would be very interesting. And also, were the ETs, just walking among humans there, or it was rare, their temples and so on?
Okay, where it was on the central island that sank, although it was an artificial island. I would assume it was in the Atlantic Ocean, and it was made up of, I think in total, 11 massive concentric rings, humongous, and water in between them, and there were bridges connecting all these and all of that. It was quite well laid out. What the architecture looked like, it looked kind of ancient Greek. Everything was white. Everything was white, except for some blue windows. And and there was a space elevator in the center that was, of course, metal and all of that. And yes, there were just ETs walking among humans, all different kinds, Dracos, Aldebaranites, a couple kinds of greys. There were some that kind of looked like, when people talk about Homo capensis, the people with the elongated skulls, there were some people who looked like that. And there were people there also who looked just like us.
Okay, what did the Aldebaran race look like?
They looked like us. They were the people who assisted the Nazis. They're Nordics. They are about 6 feet tall, blonde, blue-eyed. A few of them have light brown hair, and in their society, having light brown hair is very extreme disadvantage. People with light brown hair are usually sterilized and are, for the most part, unable to get jobs or anything like that. They're extremely, I don't think you could even say racist, they're just extreme in their obsession with being blonde and blue-eyed. So, but you could walk up to one today, if they were living on Earth, you could walk up to them, talk with them, take them home, have sex with them, get married and have kids with them, and grow old with them, and you would never once imagine that they were not a Terran human. They pass completely and totally. And, let's see, I can add that things there were surprisingly similar to what you would see today. Like, people did have like TVs, people played video games and things like that, but it was like a cut above because everything was psychically driven, and it was a telepathic society. Well, partially. People did speak languages, but when we were sent there, we could not speak anything, and that was a complete non-issue with the locals because they were, I guess, used to that. Immigrants arriving from wherever and unable to speak the language, and so they would just switch to telepathy, no problem. Oh, one thing that people had as pets were griffins, about 6 feet from tip of their beak to the end of their tail. Black mostly, some were gray. They were really gorgeous, and that was what the rich people had as their main pets, which is interesting. Let's see, what else? There was also a slavery issue, major slavery issue, which people don't really talk about when they talk about like reviving Atlantis and regaining our lost heritage from Atlantis and all of these things. They had so much slavery that if you ask me, I think they kind of had it coming. The main slaves were these. They looked like small grays, but their skin was a cobalt blue. Really beautiful little guys. And I've met them during other missions. They're actually not too bad, but they hate Terran humans, and these other species who were in Atlantis because of how they were treated back then. And you would see them out walking around, carrying the rich and powerful sometimes, and sweeping the streets wearing big metal slave collars with like a radio antenna coming off of it to kill them if they thought of revolt. So that was what Atlantis was like. Living there, I lived there quite comfortably. I had a house, and again, it was surprisingly similar to what you would see in a house today. There was a TV, there was electricity of some kind. There were not flushing toilets, interestingly. The toilet had some sort of a system where it would break down the waste at a molecular level and then dispense of it somehow in that way. Nature-wise, there was actually very little nature there. I mean, people had plants, people had gardens and things, but there wasn't a lot of real nature to be seen. Oh, and it had a force field over it to protect it from rogue waves or tsunamis and storms and things of that nature. And I believe the way that it fell was that someone switched that off covertly and then used their earthquake machine or an earthquake machine or something like it to cause a tsunami that came in and wiped it out. So it was actually quite vulnerable. It relied entirely on that one thing to keep them safe, and it failed.
What was the space elevator's function, and where did it take you?
It took you to a platform in lower orbit. It was just going up from the surface up into lower orbit, and it was a big ring up there where ships could dock and what have you. A spaceport, I guess you could say.
What did the common people look like in terms of skin color, race, etc.?
I assume you're referring to the human-looking ones. They mostly looked European, predominantly blonde or red-haired. There were some more perhaps Hispanic-looking ones, and there were a fair number of Asians. They would probably be closest to Thais or Cambodians in terms of appearance. There were other species there. I mentioned there were some tall whites, Anunnaki. There was a small Draco community. There was a Lyran community, or at any rate, a cat people community. I don't know if they were specifically the Lyran ones or if they were a different felinoid. And there were some Syrian dog people. Canonians is the correct diminutive.
The ruling class of Atlantis, what was their appearance? Did you see any Anunnaki/hybrid rulers or elites?
Yes, there were some Anunnaki who were at the head of it. I can't remember any names, but yes, there were Anunnaki and there were a few Draco. This was back before there was quite the amount of animosity between those two species as there is today. They made up the bulk of the ultra-wealthy, although there were some Terrans who made that up. I'm in contact with another member of the community who is not public, but who her altar was there as a member of a royal family, and so she was quite high up, and her altar, of course, was Terran. So that wasn't unheard of either.
Do you remember that the slaves were engineered there?
I don't know if they were engineered there. In fact, I'd say they were not. I would say they were convicts who were forced into slave labor from some planet that they had conquered or something. I don't recall them being engineered there. Perhaps they were engineered off-site. This was the capital city. Perhaps they were engineered in some other colony, but they were not engineered there.
Did you see any pyramids, and if yes, what style and what functions did they have?
I cannot remember any pyramids in the capital. I have seen them in other Atlantean outposts that I've been to, and they mostly just house Stargate. So I guess they serve a purpose for travel more than anything.
Do you remember any temples in Atlantis and any interaction with the sea creatures in those temples?
Well, the temples start off with the main religion there was Tiamatism, the worship of Tiamat, the dragon goddess, person, creature, whatever you want to call her. That was the most common thing. There were other religions represented there that I didn't really interact with. They kept very much to themselves. What the temples are like is basically just a colonnade, and in the center there's a statue of Tiamat, usually gold-plated, and people would, with an altar in front of it, and people would make offerings there. Not like sacrifices. They would offer like crops, or, well, not crops. These weren't farmers. They would offer foodstuffs and flowers and valuables and things like that. I never saw anyone performing any sacrifices, and I don't know, I guess it worked to an extent because people kept doing it. I did not partake really in the religion at all because probably people knew I was an outsider because I couldn't speak the language, and it would have looked weird for me to have tried to partake, so that's what I can recall of that. Oh, and the interaction with the sea creatures. There was another level underneath what was on the surface that I've talked about, and it was full of aquatic life, mostly aquatic alien people, who, by the way, still have cities deep underwater on Earth to this day. They were only very slightly affected by the fall of Atlantis. With the sea life, I can recall people would sometimes interact with the whales or with manta rays, but I don't recall too much besides that, that I witnessed, at any rate.
Can you talk more about your work? What did you try to accomplish? What artifacts did you take back?
Okay, my work and mission there was just getting technology from aliens and from Atlantis itself. That was it, was getting technology to send back to Camp Hero to be reverse engineered. That was the beginning and end of my mission there. The rest I had to figure out for myself. My work there, like I said, I was just a curator in this museum full of artifacts from across the galaxy that people would bring in. I don't exactly remember what I took back, except... Oh no, I do remember one thing I took back was a weapon. It looked more or less like a typical gold-plated spear, but it was not. It had a beam that would come off of it and vaporize anything up to like a quarter mile up ahead of you, or I can't remember what that is in meters, I'm sorry to say. At 400 meters, I think. I remember that one, and I remember taking back some scrolls, but for the most part all I did was photograph the shit out of these different artifacts, both outside and inside of them, because it would have been noticed if they had gone missing. So I did that, and then I would either take the photos to the portal, or I would leave them in a dead drop which was in a public garden underneath a bush, and someone came and got it. I have no idea who. They heavily compartmentalize these sorts of things so that no one person ever actually knows what they're doing.
I know you said that there was another mission to Atlantis right at the time of its fall. What was that about?
That was a raiding mission. It was within moments before the fall. We came in, we were going in, a huge squad with machine guns and heavily armed. We're going in, raiding homes and museums and everywhere that we could find, again, technology. That was the reason we were there, was getting technology. And raiding all that, and then we went back, and within maybe seconds after we returned, it fell. So there was no chance of anyone catching up to us or stopping us or anything like that. That's what that was about.
Any other interesting details you can remember of the place?
Not that I can think of. I just remember it was a really interesting place. It was such an eclectic mix of aliens, and it was and humans, and it felt almost like the natural order of things, except for the slavery. That's about what I would say about it.
When going on long-term missions, did you have a handler living with you? And did you have any local collaborators who assisted you and knew you were from the future?
Yes, we always had handlers living with us. At least everyone that I knew did, always, without fail, because couldn't have us escaping or anything like that, of course. Any local collaborators who assisted you and knew you were from the future, that depends. I believe there were a few people who assisted me in Atlantis. I don't recall anyone at all assisting us when we were in Egypt. And there were some people who assisted us during the Chinese missions who knew where we were from, which we'll talk about later, because that's some stuff that I still feel the effects of in my life, I guess you could say. And off-planet, yes. When we were doing off-planet missions, yes, people knew, because, I mean, usually we would be with aliens who were psychic and could tell immediately anyway, so there was no point in even trying to hide it. Like I mentioned in the Bellatrix Secunda mission, and in a number of others, where we would go and live amongst an alien population for whatever reason. Oftentimes we didn't even know the reason, we just had to live there and report back what we saw, and we never knew what became of that intel.
Do you remember there being a time police that was trying to prevent what you were doing in time?
I imagine there were people who went in after we had done what we had done. There were no confrontations that I can recall in Alex's era. In Kyle's era, yes, but not in Alex's period do I recall ever coming across that.
How would a life mission end? Would you say goodbye to your friends and family there somehow? Did you fake your own death or just disappear?
Usually you would just disappear, so that there would be no record keeping, because they didn't want records being kept, and throughout much of history, if someone just disappeared, they didn't keep records, but if someone died, they did. So usually you would just disappear. I would sometimes write a letter secretly, which I was not supposed to do. I got caught more than once, and I was in massive trouble for that. That was considered insubordination. That was not the done thing. But like I said, usually you would just disappear. The person you were with, whoever, if you had gotten married, or if you were in a relationship, or if you had children or whatever, they would wake up one day and find you were gone, and they would never know what had happened to you. It was really rather cruel to these people, but that was how it worked.
Did you or anyone ever not want to go back to Montauk after a life mission and manage to stay? And how did this play out?
Yes, many people didn't want to go back for, I think, pretty obvious reasons. No, I'd never heard of a successful case of it. They would always be taken back, either resignedly consenting, quote-unquote, or kicking and screaming, or be killed and taken back and regened. You didn't get to stay away. It was just wasn't on the table.
Okay, and the last question. How much time would pass on the base at Montauk between someone stepping out a portal and stepping back in from a long-term mission?
Usually no more than 15 minutes, sometimes an hour or two. There was one time where it took a full 24 hours because of regime change after Junior and all that, but ordinarily no more than 15 minutes was the general max limit.